Hello, my name is Simon Harrop and I'm a sensory branding consultant. It's possibly fair to say that I'm, if not the world's leading sensory branding consultant, I'm one of them because I've been doing it for over 25 years. I've been there and I've done it all. But what does a sensory branding consultant mean? So over the next few weeks I'm going to be posting video blogs, sharing my experience, sharing my knowledge of this subject, because I believe we live in an open world these days, and if I share this information, the more it gets out there, then the more I think as a subject it will grow, and the more people that will become interested in it, and therefore it's ultimately better for me. So I'm going to be talking about what sensory branding is. That will be the first video blog. That's the one that you're looking at now. And then subsequent video blogs will be looking at methodologies, tools, frameworks that you can use in your business to bring the benefits of multisensory branding to your brand, to your company, to your organization. So I wanted to start today with a little bit of a look at why we should be interested in this subject at all. There's a lot of talk of it in the press and in other video blogs and in marketing circles generally. But I think it's important to define what it means and how it can work for you and why it's important. So I'd like to start with this first chart. And really, for me, the first question I want to answer and to discuss is, what is a brand? And there are various different definitions. You can look in Google or Wikipedia, but what I've learned over the years is that a brand is essentially a promise. And it's the promise that the company, organisation makes, whether it's a service or a product, to consumers. Now the interesting thing is that that promise is then experienced by consumers, customers, in the service or the product itself. And the best brands, the really good and strong brands, what we experience is congruent, is consistent with what the brand promises in the advertising and the communications. So really good brands always deliver effectively what you expect. And what you expect is built up of your complete experience of everything that they say about themselves. And where those two things are aligned, it leads to a very strong brand relationship, brand to consumer. Some brands promise a lot but actually deliver very little, and those tend to be the ones that aren't around for very long. The other thing that is important for brands, and I mention it now, is that the brand has to be very different from its competitor. So it needs to be congruent with the promise and differentiated. I'd like to pull up a chart now, and this next chart is really trying to understand why and how we interrelate with brands. And again, what I've learned over the years is that we tend to think that we're a rational being, but if you look at our relationship to a brand on a continuum between our rational thinking and our emotional selves on one axis, and then on the other axis you chart our relationship to brands from a conscious point of view, what we're actually thinking about logically and bringing in our front of mind, compared with what we think about or how we respond without even thinking, in fact, what I would call subconscious or non-conscious, our non-conscious relationship to brands. It's my contention, which is very strongly borne out by all the research on this subject, that most of our relationship to a brand is at the bottom left. It's emotional and it's largely non-conscious. We're not really even thinking about it. Stephen Pasikoff, a famous brand architect and consultant, says that 70% of our relationship to brands is emotional. So not only do our brands have to be congruent in terms of the promise and experience, they have to do that at a deep emotional level. The next chart I want to bring up is actually as a result of some work that was done by my colleague Martin Lindstrom when he wrote the book Brand Sense, out of which my business spun some 5 years ago. And Martin did one of the biggest pieces of research into this subject ever done It was across 20 countries, 13 brands, thousands of consumers. And he wanted to understand how we built relationships to brands across each of the 5 senses. He wanted to understand, whether one sense was more important than another. And this chart really represents the output of that, the top line output of that research. And the blue bars are actually how consumers said the relative importance of each of the senses to their relationship to a brand. So you can see that, yes, primarily we are visual beings, but the fascinating thing is that you see how much the other senses are in balance with the sense of vision. So we're actually, as human beings, as mammals if you like, we're very balanced as to how we interact with brands across all 5 senses and the relative importance of them to us. But the really interesting thing is that when we looked at how marketing directors spent their marketing budget and allocated them across those 5 senses, there is a huge over-reliance on the sense of vision. About 83–84% of all brand communications appeals to the eyes alone, leaving just, and there's about 10–12% to sound, leaving just 3 or 4% to smell, taste and touch. Now this is really interesting because for me, I've learnt over the years through the research and the work that I've been doing that about how the brain works, about the human brain works. And there is an outer part of the brain called the cortex, which is largely responsible for processing rational thought. And then there is an inner part of the brain called the limbic system, which processes emotions and memories. And the fascinating thing is that when you understand how the senses work, the sense of sight is primarily managed and interpreted by the cortex. It's rational. Vision is largely rational. Whereas smell and taste, and smell in particular, has a direct connection between the olfactory bulb in the nose directly to the limbic system, which is why when we smell something, we get an immediate and very direct and emotional response that very often triggers powerful memories to us. So bringing this back full circle, remember that we were saying that a brand experience needs to be congruent with the promise, and that our relationship is largely emotional. If we want to create emotional experiences for our brands that are consistent with the promise, we really must think about how our brand experience smells, how it tastes and how it touches, as well as just how it looks and feels. So far too often brand guidelines, brand manuals go no further than sight and sound. And it's my contention, and which we'll be exploring over the next few blogs, that brands have to start planning themselves from the point of view of smell and taste and touch and integrate all 5 senses holistically. There's one final point that I want to make in this first blog. When we did some research for the McDonald's brand, we had created a signature brand fragrance, which was driven from the brand values, and the idea was that it was all part of the brand experience. McDonald's knew they had a problem. They knew that their brand was associated with the smell of stale French fry oil. And they came to us and they said, look, can you help us get rid of this negative association for our brand? And what we said to them was, not only can we turn that negative through to a neutral, we can actually make, we believe, the sense of smell a positive part of the brand experience. So working with the brand values, we did a process that we call perception mapping, and we'll be looking at this at subsequent blogs, to take those brand values and translate them into olfactory notes, into a signature brand fragrance. We then did some research. We did about 5 different types of research, but one of the really interesting ones is that we used fMRI brain scanning, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a way of looking at the effect of a sensory stimulus in the brain in real time. And so what we did is we introduced McDonald's consumers to pictures of McDonald's in the brain scanner, And what you can see is you can see their brain light up as they recognize the brand and they relate to the brand and they engage with the brand on an emotional level. Separately, we put the same consumers into the scanner and introduced the McDonald's fragrance that we created. Fascinatingly, there was exactly the same emotional response in the brain. It triggered exactly the same sort of area to the same extent. What we then did is we put the consumers back in the scanner and we introduced the smell and the visual brand stimuli at the same time. And this was fascinating. It was like fireworks going off in the brain. It was multiplying and really over impacting on the emotions. And just to sum up this first video blog, it was considered a hugely significant piece of research because it very, very strongly supported a hypothesis that psychologists had had for many years called super additivity. And it's very simply this: as you add senses to a piece of communication and emotional engagement for a brand, you don't add emotion, you multiply emotion. So for the senses, 1 + 1 = 3. What stronger argument could there be for thinking about the sensory impact, the multisensory impact of your brand? So I look forward to seeing you at the next blog. Thank you.